there was one thing in him, that is the strength, two things actually, the strength of character and knowledge on the subject. These two things took him to a height that all 6'4", 6'5" used to look like this. That gave us a lesson that it's not how you look, it's not what you have physically that matters. What matters is what you have internally, what you carry between your ears. That's what matters most. He was, in Odia, we have a word called Jajabaro. Jajabaro is nomad. He was a lifelong nomad. He was a bachelor. He lived out of his suitcase. In Delhi, he spent about 25 years or more. And he had just two suitcases. One for domestic use and the other for international use, because he used to go abroad every 6 months. Just like that. So he was a lifelong nomad, lived out of suitcases. Here 7 days, there 6 days, right, like that. His end also came just like that. It was the day before Raksha Bandhan. He had 4 sisters. He used to go to Bhopal, that's where he hailed from. He used to go to Bhopal every Rakhi. And that was a kind of a family reunion. The sisters will come and like that. So on that day, it was raining heavily, 28th evening. He had to catch a train from Nijamuddin station at 9:30 sometime. So he went there, and there was a student with him, a Urdu journalism student. He reached Nijamuddin station, and on the platform, he suffered a massive heart attack, and he collapsed. This student at 9:30 in Nijamuddin, he struggled a lot, took him to AIMS, but it also took him 1.5 hours to reach AIMS, and Professor Shrivatsava was declared dead on arrival. That's the life of Professor K. M. Shrivatsava in a nutshell. He has written several books. He has been here for 2 years. I had worked, all of us who were at IMC Enkenal, we worked closely with him. He has written about 3-4 books right here in Enkenal. I have had the privilege of working with him closely. I know how he functioned. I know the ideas that he carried in his mind. I know his grasp and understanding of issues, national and international. So after his demise as a tribute, we decided to have an annual lecture. This is the 6th annual lecture, and we are very happy to get Professor Kanchan Malik to deliver this 6th annual K. M. Shrivatsava annual lecture. And I'm also happy that this lecture is on community media. Media is for community, but what is this community media? Presently, many of us have come across community radio. There are about 200 community radio, dozen plus community television, about 50 or like 6 dozen community newspapers. What exactly differentiate this community media from other media that we see? That's one question that we all ask ourselves. Another couple of questions, or probably problems that community media do face. The first one is money. How do they survive? How does community media survive? Where do they get money? If they take money from the government, then what is the difference between government media and the community media? If they do not, then where do they get money to function? That's one. Number two, if it's media by the community, of the community, for the community, then what about quality? Who are there specialized persons to monitor or ensure quality? Or community media do mean quality or municipality? I mean, that's another question. Third is, what about content? Who decides the content and how? And do the mixture of contents that goes in community media really help community? These are some of the questions an ordinary person might have. Professor Malik has given has given us the main points of a talk. Initially, I wanted to circulate, but then I decided against it. I'll be doing it after her deliberation. But before that, may I request Jyoti Prakash Mahapatra to introduce Professor Kanchan Malik. Not that she requires introduction. जैसे कहते हैं ना कि वो कोई introduction के मोहताज नहीं है. But I guess in the fitness of things, may I request Jyoti Prakash to speak a few words about Professor Kanchan Malik, introducing her. Thank you, Jyoti.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. Professor Kanchan K. Malik works at the Sarojini Naidu School of Arts and Communication at University of Hyderabad. She is a faculty fellow with UNESCO Chair on Community Media and editor of CR News, Community Radio News. Ma'am does extensive qualitative research on community media, women in community communication, and media ethics. She is co-author of various books like Other Voices, The Struggle for Community Radio in India, that's published by Sage in 2007. A recent co-edited book is titled Community Radio in South Asia, Reclaiming the Airwaves, published by Routledge in 2020. This is about ma'am, a short, very short introduction. It's over to you, sir.
Thank you, Jyoti. And now on to the lecture. May I request Professor Malik to deliver the 6th Professor K.M. Shrivatsava Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrinal sir. Thank you, Jyoti Prakash ji. And I'm going to start the lecture. If there are any issues with the internet, or if you're not able to hear me well, please warn me, because I would not come to know, right? So with that having said, let me first thank the Indian Institute of Mass Communication, Dhenkanal, and its immensely accomplished director, Professor Dr. Mrinal Chatterjee, for inviting me to deliver the 6th K.M. Shrivatsava Memorial Lecture. I feel honored and privileged to be here with you. As we heard, Professor Shrivatsava was not only an admired academic, but also a respected administrator and an excellent human being. I had the opportunity to meet him when I was a student, and I'm familiar with his work. It is therefore with humility that I approach my topic for today, community media, vocal for local. So let me begin by reading out some names. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you are.
Thank you.
Loud and clear.
Okay. So as I said, I was going to read out some names. I'll start with Ujjas, then Mandeshi Tarang, Namaskar, Alfaze Mewat, Waqt Ki Awaz, Lalit Lokvani, Khabar Lehriya, Nityanand Janwani, video volunteers, Salam Namaste, Radio Madhuban, Rimjim Radio, Radio Bundelkhand, Sangam Radio, Namadhwani, Radio Brahmaputra, Rudino Radio, Radio Matoli, Kadalosai, and of course Radio Dhimsa, Radio Muskan. I could go on and on. There are many more. I'm not sure though if you have heard any of these names before. All of these are different kinds of community media found in India. Majority of them, as you could make out, is they are community radios, but also participatory video initiatives and community newspapers. Some of them in Odisha, and many of the community media I have mentioned have won prestigious national awards for their programming and content. I'm really wondering if you have had a chance to tune into, watch, or read any of these. We are more familiar with the big or the so-called mainstream media with their celebrity RJs and journalists. So Radio Mirchi, Radio City, and Fever FM, which you and I listen to as we drive to work in our cars. And then News 18, Times Now, NDTV that we watch at prime time before we go to bed. And of course, the broadsheets that are a must read as we begin our day. The big media are no doubt essential. They have their well-defined relevance as well as roles to play, and to some extent have become an indispensable part of our lives. But when the focus is on local issues, vocal for local, ordinary people's concerns, grassroots democracy, and social change, the media that one usually turns to are community media. The overarching philosophy of community media, as Mrinal sir also mentioned, and it is acknowledged universally, that they are a tool for social justice and a platform for community voices and local expressions. Community media seek to counter the negative consequences of globalization and commercialization of media by facilitating democratic participation in communication, social change, civic life, and political articulations. As community-driven, citizens-owned, volunteer-run, not-for-profit setup, community media position themselves differently in their processes, principles, practices, their style, and substance in comparison to the state-owned and the commercial media. Community media have gained credence worldwide as A, an alternative to the mainstream media, B, an entity owned and managed by marginalized groups. Marginalization could be on account of caste, gender, ethnicity, or class. C, as an instrument to deliver sustainable development. And D, a means to strengthen the communication rights of people. However, what distinguishes community media as a tool to foster development is that it is not simply about doing something for the community, but about community doing something for itself, owning its media resources, and getting involved as a stakeholder in the process of program making and eventually social change. My research work for the past over 2 decades has been with community radio. The conventional philosophy of community radio is that it is recognized as the voice of the disadvantaged. It's looked upon as the mouthpiece of the unheard, and generally, again, like most community media, as a tool for participatory development that is based on discursive democracy and freedom of expression. Many nations across the world are making efforts to promote community broadcasting as a legitimate sector within their respective mediascapes. In most countries, community broadcasting is typically identified as the third tier of broadcasting. The other two being first, the public or the government-run broadcasting network as All India Radio or Akashvani in India. And of course, second is the private commercial FM or radio. So there is a lot of buzz around community radio these days, as they have played a crucial role during the COVID-19 pandemic. The community connect and the local presence was evident throughout the coronavirus crisis, as community radio stations across the world, but more specifically, I can speak for South Asia, stepped forward, assumed responsibility, and despite challenges, emerged as a vital and reliable link between the government and the people at the grassroots. Through a combination of terrestrial broadcasting, social media, and personal engagement, the community radio stations contributed to community awareness, preparedness, and served in meaningful ways as catalysts to combat the coronavirus pandemic. They proved without doubt that community radio is not merely about making programs. It is about serving community and reaching the unreached. The essence of any community media lies in its localness. Community radio stations introduced creativity and variety in their content during COVID-19, I'm saying. Whether it was airing folk songs about the theme of social distancing and isolation, or making the COVID-19 vocabulary, the words that we take for granted, quarantine, lockdown, pandemic, hand hygiene, vaccine, N95, comprehensible for their listeners. So as nations went under lockdowns, compelled to close their borders and impose restrictions, community radio stations were on air, supporting their listeners in the most ingenious ways. Sometimes reporters were working from home. So they were broadcasting vital, verified, and village level news in local languages through skits, songs, folk tales, and even through live phone-in programs. They were making the community participate. All broadcasts, including the programs on COVID-19, they were aired in the local language, or rather the local dialect. The content which was produced communicated clearly with the people in their vernacular style and rural accent. In Odisha, community radio stations co-opted traditional Pala singers to advocate social distancing and hygiene protocols to their listeners in local languages. From furnishing judicious and timely information about COVID-19 to handling anxieties, from busting rumors and debunking fake news to presenting quiz shows on coronavirus and playing favorite song lists, and from running schooling programs to establishing helplines for counseling, the community radio stations were staying tied to their communities. This brings me to the question that I get asked often by young researchers and scholars as to the scholarly basis that explains the need for community media. So most scholarly work locates community media in the context of globalization. So although a much contested concept, globalization is understood broadly as restructuration of social, economic, and cultural geographies as a consequence of advancement in technologies that enable enhanced interconnectedness and flexibility of transactions. With the advancement of technology all around us in a globalized world, media are looked upon both as facilitators of phenomenon of globalization and those that have been affected and transformed by it. So as an industry, if we look at media, they have gained much from globalization as they are able to reach a wider market to create profits. However, scholars concerned about cultural sovereignty and cultural rights contend that media globalization has contributed to a one-way transmission of ideas and values that result in the displacement of indigenous cultures. So the strongest culture that globalized media may be credited with establishing is one that considers generating consumption as an overarching virtue, and thereby turns media content into commodity and media organizations as producers of content that grabs the maximum audiences. The outcome of all this is the homogenization of media output across the world, guided by economies of scale and profit maximization. To put it simply and in the Indian context, you have heard of the LPG era. No, we are not talking of cooking gas here, but liberalization, privatization, and globalization as the mantras of development that happened in the 1990s, attributed again to the advancement of technologies. There was the satellite revolution with multiple media channels beaming into our homes, followed by the boom in information and communication technologies and the privatization of media industries because of the deregulation of government control. This led to vertical integration aided by cross media ownership and gigantic multinational media conglomerates having what is called the oligopolistic control over media. And you will agree, whoever owns the media sets the agenda and thereby the terms of public debate. So the paradox, if you observe carefully, is that there is multiplication of media outlets, but similar kind of programming across the channels. Much of the grammar, constructs, and methods of organizing and creating media are such that they are mainly aimed at gaining eyeballs and TRPs. This has resulted in media catering fundamentally to commercial and political interests, and only people with power and pelf have access to media, resulting in a democratic deficit. An analysis from media globalization perspective, therefore, compels one to think, who do global media speak to and about? Is advancement of communication technology catering only to the market for its hegemonic purpose of influencing the preferences and perceptions of the people? Therefore, an alternative media, form of media, not guided by simply propaganda and profit, is necessary to revive the diversity and plurality of information in the public sphere. So this is one theoretical or scholarly entry point to understanding community media. Another theoretical anchor for community media comes from development and social change advocates who were concerned that the development potential of media has been lost because of commercialization. Apprehensive about the appropriation of media, they were articulating that the progressive development potential of media must not be lost, and there ought to be spaces to generate content that are change oriented, locally relevant, socially responsible, as well as culturally rooted. Popular and community-based media, such as provincial newspapers or community newspapers, community radio, participatory video, popular theater, and independent documentaries, are some of the significant alternatives that are looked upon as social change media that cater to people at the grassroots. The elementary distinction between community media and other media is a high degree of people's participation, both in management and program production, with primary sources of support for its individual being individual for its operations. The main support for its operations comes from individual community members and local institutions. Community media is in the community, for the community, about the community, and by the community. Famously, it is said that community media is only 10% about media and 90% it is about community engagement. Scholars have asserted that for developing nations, community media has proven to be one of the best ways to reach excluded or marginalized communities in targeted, useful ways and giving them a voice that matters in communication for development. Community radio specifically provides the crucial last mile connectivity to people who live in the so-called remote areas, besides being a relatively affordable and simple medium to operate. Radio allows for easy penetration among populations who are not formally literate and encourages creative engagement through minimum training. Radio has high penetration and can reach communities at the end of the development road. It is essentially appropriate for cultures that are dominated by orality, where knowledge is passed on through storytelling and word of mouth. Radio's widespread ownership and familiarity makes it a people's medium. So radio receivers are economical. You can receive FM on mobile phones. You find radio sets hanging on the bicycles of farmers, and they are found in kitchens, giving company to women in rural households. When we envisage community media as a facilitator for social change, there is we are pointing towards also a paradigmatic shift in the thinking or the approach to development itself. So post World War II, when many countries like India got their independence, they started the exercise of nation building and modernization. The so-called, again, dominant paradigm employed mass media for information dissemination through diffusion of innovation to move from being, traditional to modern societies. Thus, development became synonymous with top-down, prescriptive expertise, centralized planning, and implementation without any active stakeholder involvement or consideration for the local context, knowledge, or culture. Now, this again had its benefits. We've had the Green Revolution and industrialization, but this approach failed either in garnering a sustained buy-in from the communities or in alleviating poverty in the third world countries, because the gains never trickle down to reach the poor. Participatory approaches to development arose as a reaction to the realization of this failure. Contrary to the one-size-fits-all approach to development, participatory development approaches, through their grassroots intervention and community mobilization, focused on active stakeholder participation in all their initiatives. They engaged with participatory forms of media as tools for facilitating inclusive development that was people-centered and that built on local knowledge through horizontal communication processes. So community media were used for this purpose, and they are known by several names globally, such as participatory media, citizens media, radical media, grassroots media. They are also called free media, rural media, popular media. And in academics, we tend to refer to them as alternative media, which can be a little problematic also. All right. They are also referred to as the medium of the civil society or looked upon as social movement media. They're driven by objectives, as I said before, of social change and empowerment of communities. And community media tend to dignify local culture and practices derived from community deliberations and the lived experiences of its people. They seek to address what is known as the voice poverty by enabling organizations and communities to learn to use media rather than to be used by media. So another frequently asked questions that we as community media academics are faced with is about, we keep saying community media. So what is this concept of community? How do you define community? The primary accountability of any community media, whether it is radio, newspaper, or video, is to adequately represent the interests of its territorial or geographical community and serve what are called the local needs. However, the conceptualizations of community need not always refer predominantly to geographical and ethnicity dimension as the basis for collective identity. There are other notions of community that are non-geographical. One non-geographical conceptualization of community is community of interest, based on the commonality of interest that could extend beyond all local, national, or international borders. For example, the Black community, students as a community, or one sharing a common health condition such as diabetes or hypertension. There are also communities of practice that share passion about a joint enterprise and expertise in specific area. For example, media educators. There could also be communities in cyberspace termed as virtual or online communities that may bring together people not known to each other. There are concepts like interpretive communities, community of meaning, imagined community. They are seen as more subjective conceptions of community, actively constructed by its members for identity related to literary criticism, cultural cohesion, and the image of communion as nation, respectively. So, geographical proximity is not an essential condition for conceptualizing a community. Even within communities structured by geography, there may exist affinities towards other communities or social compositions outside of that community. Moreover, virtually, culturally, or organically integrated communities, look at gated communities, may not necessarily be internally harmonious and homogeneous entities, and they're often marked by internal conflict, oppression, and patriarchy. No community is a discrete unit and has internal networks. So communities within communities. Communities are dynamic in that people's affiliations are not static and may change over time. Thus, it becomes crucial to understand the subtleties of community living while examining the role that any form of community media can play in bringing about change that seeks to address the existing conflicts and social hierarchies. It is not just the concept of community that lends itself to contested interpretations, but in any endeavor to analyze community media, there cannot be a monotheoretical perspective. There is no one way of looking at community media. There is heterogeneity of forms. There is multidimensionality of processes. There is intersection of perspectives. One community media could stand for one thing and the other for another thing. And there are hybridity in the approaches followed by various community-based media initiatives. However, alternative social cultural values, wider social participation, democratic ideals, informed and mobilized citizenry, these are the common basis for distinguishing community media from the mainstream media practices. Community media scholars call for alternative media to be this is a commonly used statement that we make: deprofessionalized, decapitalized, and deinstitutionalized, to include people normally excluded from mainstream media, right? So non-professionals can also be part of community media, and it is not for profit, so not really guided by capital interests, and it's not so it's flexible in terms of its institutional setup. It is important that even though certain universal principles and practices like these may be considered as non-negotiable for community media. A non-essentialist perspective on community media becomes necessary, as there are multiple ways in which community media identify themselves. Let me explain this with an example. In many parts of the world, community radio is looked upon as a discursive space that supports what Maniozo, building on Freire's concept of pedagogy of the oppressed, calls as the new pedagogy of listening that recognizes subaltern voices. The free radios of Germany increasingly focus attention on the fate of migrants, such as the lack of adequate housing, poverty, unemployment, racism, and cultural isolation, with their sensitive programming, which is broadcast in a range of Arab and African languages. Community radio stations in Australia, Canada, Brazil, and Mexico, and in remote parts of Tanzania, Mali, India, and Nepal are addressing issues concerning the rights of indigenous people and their languages and cultural identities. In the South Asian subcontinent, with a tragic history of devastating natural disasters, community radios in Nepal, Bangladesh, and even in India have shown exemplary fortitude and ability to mobilize swift community action during earthquakes, cyclones, and floods. Displaying a great deal of ecological commitment and maturity, many of the community radio stations have expanded their remit to go beyond immediate disaster mitigation and engaged with more complex and long-term problems of environmental communication and climate change. So every community radio has its own set of vision, its mandate, and so on. So as I move to the last part of my lecture, let me trace the journey of community radio that has come a long way as a form of community media in many countries of South Asia. Community radio in South Asia symbolizes the freeing of airwaves for use by civil society organizations in the region, and it suitably mirrors the socio-political, economic, and cultural diversity that is found in the South Asian region. The logic that binds the growth of this sector in this region is development and social change, essentially. Nepal today has over 300 community radio stations to flaunt, including the first ever established in the region, Radio Sagarmatha. In 1997, that was established. Even though the country still awaits a clear-cut policy on community radio. Bangladesh policy for community radio was announced in 2008, revised in 2018, and it has 18 community radio stations on air, guided by Bangladesh NGOs Network for Radio and Communication, BNNRC, and Bangladesh Community Radio Association, BCRA. In India, community radio came late, but is now gaining traction. The struggle for community broadcasting dates back to 1995, backed by the landmark ruling by Supreme Court, which stated that airwaves constitute public property and must be utilized for advancing public good. With the expanded community radio policy put in place in 2006, India now has a little over 300 community radio stations. Other countries like Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Maldives do not have community broadcasting, but they plan to introduce regulatory frameworks to leverage its potential for achieving national development goals. Among the many other mandates and campaigns that community radios are associated with in India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, the one that I closely follow is their commitment to women empowerment through building of media production competencies among women. So community radio stations are not only opening up spaces for women's participation in communication, but several organizations are also undertaking path-breaking, capacity-building efforts to train women in the traditional male domains of technically handling the running of community radio stations also. Women are creating gender-sensitive programming, reviving oral forms, and mobilizing members from the community through their networking and confidence-building efforts to deliberate on issues concerning women and girls. There are many women reporters and station managers of community radio stations in different parts of India who rule the airwaves in rural India. They are celebrities in their own rights and they have a finger on the pulse of their local community. Some of these women who, with their passion and commitment, have led by example and struggled to shatter the stereotypes include, I'm just giving a few names, Shanta Koshti of Rudino Radio, Preeti Soni of Sayya Rejo, these are from Gujarat, Radha Shukla of Waqt Ki Awaaz, Seema Bharti Shrivatsava of Voice of Azamgarh, both from Uttar Pradesh, G. Gandhimati of Periyar Community Radio, Tamil Nadu, Vandana from Gurgaon Ki Awaaz, Haryana, Aarti Bish from Hevalwani, Odisha has Rosaline, who is quite well known as a community radio reporter also. So their efforts have produced results and small steps have been initiated through radio programs on subjects such as women sarpanch, menstrual health, child marriage, drug addiction, caste, women's education, women farmers, women as farmers, and more. So according to Radha Shukla, the true potential of community radio will be realized when rural women gain the confidence to ask questions to themselves, to their community, and to their government. When that happens, we can proudly say our work is done, is what she says. Similarly, community newspapers covering distant districts in rural India, Namaskar in Odisha, Khabar Lehriya in Bundelkhand, are changing the gendered narratives in media, and women journalists of these community newspapers take pride in invading a field that is considered as the domain of only men in the rural areas. Finally, a word of caution is in order. I am not suggesting that community media by itself will reverse decades of oppression, eradicate poverty, and usher positive social change in the lives of the poor. That would be an argument based on technological determinism. There is no doubt that community media, with its local character and more democratic access, provides immense opportunities for interest articulation at the margins of society and contributes to the process of inclusive social change. This grassroots media making will have its full impact only when it goes with appropriate political climate that recognizes the rights of the people to a dignified life, social policies that address societal inequities, and an environment in which a plural cultural landscape can be taken for granted. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a wonderful, wonderful lecture on community media.
Thank you.
I must congratulate Professor Malik for this wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
Now, the floor is open for questions and comments as well. I can see there are 30 odd people listening to this lecture. If anybody has any questions or comments, in fact, I have a couple of them, a couple of questions. But if anybody else is having any question, I'd like to. If there are none or they are still framing the question, then my question, Malik, Kanchanji, is this. The community radio, community media is for the community, of the community, by the community. And every community, they try to speak about that community, their history, their present state, their problems. In a country like India, where there is so much plurality, there could be places or there could be issues which are contagious. There could be issues of, say, sharing of natural resources. There could be issues which can relate to ethnocentrism. In that case, why I'm asking this question is the number of community radio stations are growing in India. In another few years, we are looking at a situation where there could be 600 plus community radio stations. In that situation, if there is an issue which might trigger some conflict, will the community radio stations add to the conflict, or will they create a situation where they can trigger more problems? खुदा ना खास्ता violence की ओर चले जाएं. If, I mean, this has happened in Rwanda, the genocide was triggered by radio. The Tutsis and the Hutus, they killed each other in majority areas wherever they were majority, and they were egged on by people through radio stations. Right? Do we have, Kanchanji, because you have been working in on community media for a very long time, do we have adequate safety measures to kind of avoid this kind of, so that this kind of situation doesn't happen in India? That's my first question, and then we may discuss over that. Yeah.
Okay. Right. No, very, very good question. This is a question that gets asked of community radios all the time, right? But if we look at the track record of community radio stations, we usually associate them more with conflict resolution.
Exactly.
Yes, rather than and peace building. In many countries across the world, community radio stations have facilitated the process of peace building, in fact. Right. And community radio is a place where people, if they have issues or conflicts, it is a place where the community can come together, talk about those issues, and resolve probably within themselves. Right. As far as using radio for creating conflict is concerned, technology, any technology for that matter, can be used for both good and bad purposes. Right. So why are we only looking at community radio as media that can create problems? Right. First of all, it is very much under the license of the government. Right. All the time, community radio stations have to follow what is called the All India Radio Code. So they cannot be airing programs that cause conflict or hate speech. So the law of the land applies to them. Right? They are very much traceable. That license is can be monitored. So I don't think, first of all, that a community radio, which is a platform where people can express the issues that they have, would necessarily lead to a conflict situation, right? But if there are people who would appropriate technologies for creating a nuisance, they can appropriate any technology. Why only community radio, right? You were talking of safety measures, or all community radio stations are meant to have 3 months of their programming. Then have to keep record of that. Anybody and everybody can come and check the programming also, right? But given the faith that I have on community radio, in fact, they say you should have more community radio stations in areas that have conflict situations, because people get an opportunity to talk about their issues there and probably resolve it among them. Right. So we internationally, we have seen community radios as peace building, as promoting a peace building mechanism by
You're right.
bringing people of diverse perspectives together.
I ask this question only to locate those safety valves. When you say they have to follow law of the land, they have to save 3 months of their content, those are safety valves. I wanted the audience also to know that there are safety valves installed within the community media setup. Now, Sambit has a question, Kanchanji. How do you look at the digital disruptions and community media playing with each other? How do you look at the digital disruptions and community media playing with each other?
Okay. I'm not sure what Sambit means by digital disruptions.
I guess Sambit is here. Sambit, are you there?
Yes, yes, yeah, I can of course say, Madam. What I would like to know that there's this digital disruptions in the sense that digital media is playing a dominant role in the media ecospace, and when we're talking about community media, we're talking about mainly community radios and newspapers. So how do you look at this change in digital space and community media? Are they merging, or are they separating each other? Separating themselves from each other. So, what is happening in the community media space?
Yeah.
So,
I get it. Yeah. So see, we cannot wish away digital media, and nobody is pitting community media against digital media at all, right? In fact, community media in many ways tries to bridge that digital divide. Yeah. If we look at the digital media today or digitization, it has still not percolated to the different remote areas in the country, right? So where there is no digital media, there are people still who do not have access to mobile phones. Especially they do not have access to smartphones, right? So it is in these areas where community media is trying to reach out to people and give them information that is not available to them, right? So it's like working together. There is a lot of information that radio stations derive out of the internet and pass it on to the community. That is also there. Community media is not exactly looking at going digital immediately, because then again it will mean that it may not remain as accessible to the ordinary people, right? And then the cost issues would be there also, right? But there is they do work. You will find a lot of community radio stations having presence in the social media, right? So they are working together. It's not as if I would not pit them against each other, right? So community media have their relevance even in the digital world, is what one would say, right? However, one would be cautious in asking community radio stations to become digital too soon, right? Because in that case, that community connect might be lost, right? Yeah.
Right.
thank you.
Vidhu Bhushan Das from KIT. He has raised his hand. Vidhu, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Vidhu is
So-
himself an expert in community media.
Yes.
No. Yeah. So it was a great lecture. I congratulate Mrinal sir and Kanchan ma'am,
Thank you.
both for organizing such lecture and delivering this beautiful lecture. I have two questions. One is a general questions, maybe beyond the talk, and the second one is some extent relating to talk. The first question is, which is beyond the talk, is relating to community radio. So what I found from my literature that community radio, both are enough romanticized. And do you not think that similarly, community radio studies is also romanticized?
Okay.
And that is question one. And if we will romanticize community radio studies like community and community radio, so what will be the future of community radio studies? Number two, if you look at the demography, women are there in 50% around women are there in the society. But when we're talking about community radio is the alternative to mainstream media, where marginalization should be addressed. Marginal people should be given scope to speak. So again, can women speak in community radio? Or this Rosaline and others, they are just a token, or you can say poster boy, poster child kind of thing in community radio. And then what kind of mantras or the strategies community radio are devising to give at least a scope to listen the women voices? Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bidu, coming from you, I mean, I understand the background where you're coming from, right? The ground level realities may not be as idealistic as we sometimes talk about community radio, right? Or community media. But the fact is, what is the reason I talked about the theoretical basis of community radio, or the reason why community radio is there, in order to reiterate some of that idealism, right? So what are these community radio stations for? What is this community? Why do we need community media, right? So the purpose for which it is set up is these basic principles that we talk about. It is meant to be for the community. It is meant to be a medium that the civil society can use. It is meant to be, a medium where people who would otherwise not have voices are able to speak or not. Now, whether it happens overnight, or that may not be the situation right now. But saying that nothing at all is happening on the ground is also the other extreme. Many of the people whom you see talking now on community radio were people who had negligible exposure to media completely, right? There are women there, and these are not just a few women. There are a whole lot of women who have never come out of their houses and and spoken on radio. They can train us in radio making today. They can train some of my students in radio making. They are so good. So yes, a little bit of idealism is there. We do share, both of us share the passion for community media. The potential is there, right? But as I said towards the end, the need is for political will to make it that ideal kind of medium that we talk about. So even if it is happening in small places and in a small way, a beginning has been made, is what one is trying to say. And we should slowly and gradually move towards that ideal. If you meet any of these women, meet some of the names that I have given you, or visit any community radio station that is totally run by women, you will see that the change has happened, right? Whether it has reached the community or not is a question that we all are asking, right? I just had a very interactive kind of workshop with a lot of women community radio producers, in order to come out with a gender manual, right? The inputs that they have given are they talk about gender, they talk about women empowerment, they talk about gender equality in the way that some of us also don't talk about. We claim to be feminists, but I think they're far ahead than we are, right? You should have been present there to see how many of these women talk. So I think they are motivated people who are part of community radio. And it's okay that you use the word romanticize. We are only if we think ahead will we reach there also. I personally, whenever I go to a community radio station, it's a reality check for me, and my faith in community radio remains as it is, right? But of course, I completely agree with you. Like Mrinalji also had said, there is need for many more community radio stations, and for us to accept some of these ideal principles that we associate with community radio and allow it to work in that way, right? So, yeah.
Thank you.
Hope that kind of addresses what you're saying.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Bidu, any other question, or do I move to Anirudh, who is in the queue?
No, I don't have any other question. I agree with ma'am. My only concern is that we have to a little bit serious when we are doing academic scrutiny of these initiatives. We have to go beyond because I found many of the studies are romanticized. So we have to take care of that. Yeah.
Sure,
Thank you, ma'am.
yeah, absolutely.
Right. Now, Anirudh, are you there?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Another community media expert. All community media experts are here today.
No, this is not because I'm a community researcher. Anyway, thank you so much, Miran sir, for the opportunity, and thank you so much, Kansan ma'am, for that so well packaged lecture with theoretical inputs as well as empirical evidences. So my question is related to the potentials of community radio. So of late, I've been writing something and I sent it to EPW. It's been accepted. It will sometime come soon. Tapping onto the or exploring the potentials of community radio as hyperlocal media and how the government or the state can tap into these community radio potentials to communicate information related to vaccine and stuff, because we have so many studies coming during this pandemic which is addressing the issues of vaccine reluctancy, vaccine hesitancy, right? So in that kind of a context, when we talk of hyperlocal media situating community radio in those interior locationally disadvantaged locations where mainstream media's presence is very negligible, and the information that are actually reaching out to those communities, for example, my own fieldwork in Kuraput in Nuapada, those interiors where the state government or the central government's notices and information are reaching out to them in the mainstream ODA language, or the Hindi or English, whatever it may be. But in that kind of a context, do we really feel that the state or the government can also tap into these hyperlocal media outlets which are actually reaching out to these communities in their own dialect, own cultural context, to leverage vaccine communication per se? And what should be an ideal approach to go about that business? Thank you so much, ma'am.
Very well said, Anirudh. Yes, I look forward to reading what you have written. But again, what I would like to add to this is that community radios can be effective medium for communicating with the people at the grassroots, especially reaching those whom where places where mainstream media has not reached. But I would like to respond to your question in another way, saying that let us distinguish this whole idea of reaching out to the communities, right? As I said, the useful part of community radio is that it doesn't just give you information or provide you with what should be done and what should not be done, right? It has that mechanism which needs to be utilized. Bidu may again say a little bit of idealism and romanticism, but if we were to use it, and it has been done in Africa, healthy communities is something you have heard of also, I'm sure, where the programming is made along with the people coming. The process of program making should be the way in which people start responding to some of these things, like if there's programming made on vaccine hesitancy or the uses of vaccine by people themselves, that will be a better buy-in there, right? So it's one advantage is that they will be listening to their own community people talking about it, right? So that is one advantage community radio has, and the credibility would be more. But the second thing is to engage people in the making of the programming. I think that is the USP of community radio. So if that were to happen, I think we can go a long way, right? So and people have a lot of talent making drama. They can come up with scripts and participate. I understand participation for everybody is not easy, but that's where probably the role of the community radio lies. I'm sure you agree with me.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you.
Now, every good thing has to end at a certain point of time. So that's time. May I request Abhishek to please offer a formal vote of thanks.
Yes, thank you, sir. So, am I audible?
Yes,
Hello?
you are.
Okay.
Yes, you are.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you all had a wonderful session today with us. I know I got to learn so much. Hope you all did too. Now it's time to conclude today's session. Hence, I would like to thank all the distinguished delegates and attendees for their participation and contribution in making the KM Shrivatsava Memorial Lecture a grand success today. I would like to express my gratitude to our chief guest, Professor Kanchan Malik, for taking time out of her hectic schedule to grace the event, of course. Ma'am, I've really found your lecture very insightful and informative, to say the least, of course. Thank you again, ma'am, and thank you, everyone. Hope we meet soon again. Please do take care of yourself and be safe. Thank you.
With that, we end sixth KM Srivastava Memorial Lecture. And next year, on this day, inshallah, we again meet. Thank you very much.